Hey everybody, Ben here from DMC Films and Cineblog Studios, and I'm back with another tutorial for you guys today. Today we're going to be doing something that I've been doing recently, and I don't know if it has a specific name, but I've been calling it shape sketching. So shape sketching uses shapes, but it also usually uses either the digital medium or some watercolor paints. So by that standpoint, it's not exactly sketching. But today I'm going to be showing you both the digital and the watercolor process for creating a base area of shapes to sort of build a landscape around. So for this demo I've got a piece of watercolor paper. This is fairly standard student grade stuff. I also have a small brush and some relatively cheap and old watercolors, but these work really well for practice. I have a small container full of water and a mixing palette off to the side. Now, normally when working with watercolors and watercolor paper, you want to tape the paper edges down, but because this is just sort of a sketch and practice and a demo, you don't really need to worry about that here. So I'm going to start out by going to our black watercolor, and really you only need one color. You can use black, brown, just some kind of a dark usually works well. Now drag some of that over to our palette. Create a very thin, light section of that watercolor. And I learned this technique by sort of watching what a lot of designers do with markers, specifically a video from Scott Robertson, which I've linked over here. You can click the annotation or the link in the description box below. I've linked to that video a lot over the course of the past 6 months in my videos, but it's definitely well worth checking out. So I developed this technique to work in place of the Copic markers, mainly because, one, I don't really care for markers in general, and Copics are extremely expensive. So what I usually do is I want to start with just a general shape. So I keep it really loose and just kind of do a little whoosh or something. Some kind of a quick movement, like so, just to get a basic shape down. And you think, okay, now I want to refine these shapes. No, you don't. Don't touch them. Don't even think about trying to change them or do anything to them. Just let them as they are. This will keep a much freer and looser mentality and kind of keep your head clear. I'm going to throw a little bit of a base land in, though. Seem to have some resist stuff going on here. I must have sprayed this with something. A little scrap piece of paper I just had sitting around. Looks like I have a little bit of this red in the black a little bit. That's okay. It's not hurting us. You can also, if you don't want to be as loose, you can throw in some more defined shapes. I usually just use the shape of the brush to do that. Maybe some interesting spirey shapes. And when I do something like this, I'm usually imagining baseland and rocks. So anything over top of this I could fill in grass and such later, but we're just looking at baseland here. Okay, now that we have a light layer, we're going to go ahead and start a little bit darker. This is really red. We want to get almost pure watercolor. Very, very dark, but not super dark. We have a little bit of that flow left. And from here, I usually try and pick a light source based on the way my rocks are going right now. I think I want that light source to come from the upper left, so all of our shadows are going to be on the lower right side of all these objects. So I'm going to use just the edge of the brush. And get a little bit of a bleed effect. You can let your layers dry in between if you want to have a sharper, crisper line, but honestly it doesn't really matter as much. You could use a little bit of a darker color. A shadow underneath. You don't want to go overboard with these shadows. We're actually going to go over top of this in pen once it dries. So really we're blocking out shapes, and we're blocking out basically really simple highlights and shadows. Now here, where these objects are a little less defined, we can play around with defining them maybe a little bit more. Try and figure out where the sections are going to connect. I'm just doing the very edge of this. I'm not trying to overpower it. And actually, this process does work a little bit better with a darker layer once you have let the first layer dry. When I'm doing this, I usually try and do like 3 or 4 at a time, so I can do all the gray layers and then all the black layers, and work in an assembly line process. I'm going to keep most of this, I think. Just kind of fill it out. But not, again, we're not going overboard, we're just letting it be what it is. Some shadows. Pull it down a little further in here. And there we have some very basic, sort of sci-fi, perhaps rock or maybe even machinery structures. They really could be anything at this point. Really, they're just base shapes, again, and highlights and shadows, or in this case, just mid-tone and shadow. So we're going to go ahead and let this dry before we move on to the next step. So now that our watercolor layers have dried, we're going to go ahead and add some final details, sort of highlights and shadows once again. And for this, I've got a Micron 03 and a Prismacolor white pencil. That's the PC938, if you would rather go by the number. So this is a nice soft colored pencil, and for this I'm just going to go add in a little bit of highlights to what we decided earlier to be the light side, which is going to be the upper left. And these are going to be probably barely noticeable, but just enough to add a little bit of offset to some of our imagery. And because we're using this pencil on watercolor paper, it's going to have a little bit of texture as well. I tend to like to go over top of where the dark edge meets the light edge, just to kind of have a little extra variation. So have it fade in a little bit. I'm going to move on to the marker. And from here, I'll detail some of the highlighted side and some of the darker side as well, just to sort of create a more defined edge. Let's say this is going to come down. This can be much more closer to a sketch, so not really being super fancy with my lines. This pen's starting to run out of ink, so lines are a little bit lighter than they probably should be, but I'm also picking up some wax. So I'm just figuring out where these shapes are going to end up hitting. I think I'll also take a graphic 1 and throw little darker sections in. Just kind of following the contour of the shapes a bit. And then you can start starting to think where the areas of land are going to end up being. Just throw a few quick lines in there. And there we have a base for possibly some kind of a landscape. Now, this technique of watercolor and sort of mixed media shape sketching isn't perfect, and it's a little bit time consuming, so another great technique is to go into Photoshop and do it digitally. So here we are sitting in Photoshop, and if you've seen my videos before, you know that I work in Photoshop Elements. And this particular technique using shape sketches, I've got the calligraphy brushes, and I've got the sort of tall vertical one that I can do these little motions with. And for when I do this, I start with sort of just basically a light gray, and I just start dropping in shapes. Sort of what can be the tops of mountains, perhaps, or whatever. Go ahead and throw in some big ones, little ones, you know, whatever they are. And a lot of times the first gray that I pick is a little bit too bright, or a little too saturated, so I actually usually take the opacity down on that layer to make it almost invisible. And then the next layer, you can kind of use that same gray that we just had, only it won't need to worry about it being overly saturated. I'm going to bring this down more, maybe take it up. And I don't really have an idea in my head, I'm just kind of playing with shapes and saying, okay, I don't want my two layers to be exactly the same, so I'm just trying to add a little variation. And we'll go a little bit darker. Maybe add a interesting little thing here. About like that. A little bit more, a little bit less. And like so. Now you can either think about these as large mountains, or you can instead think about them as base structures, and that's how I think about them when I work. So for example, we can take that layer in the back and start throwing in some simple grass. Just going to get sort of a light grayish green. And I've got a set of brushes in here that are my custom brush set you can find on my website as well as on my DeviantArt page. And I got a fan brush in here that works really well, so we're going to apply our pressure sensitivity and just start laying in the area of that grass. I think I'll make it a little darker since I'm working on that lower opacity on that layer. And so you can choose to put your land a little further up. You can just make bigger decisions on where that lower section of the land is, and maybe think it's not so much of a tall rock valley, and maybe they're just sort of sticking up a little bit further out. I'm going to move into the next layer up, so you can see that a little bit better. A little bit here, a little bit here. And then the furthest or closest layer to us, it's a little bit darker, a little more saturated. And again, I'm just throwing in some base color here very easily, not really paying attention to a whole lot of detail or anything, but you can get rid of the idea of a whole lot of rocks and just use that as your base land. And just like that, you have a quick little sketch shape study, and you can just sort of play around with it from here, add, you know, highlights and shadows, maybe throw in a sky. I think we'll do that right now. We'll grab a little bit bigger of a brush, a little bit of blue, and work our way in, build up a gradient, and blur it out. And just like that, you've created a quick landscape just with a few simple shapes. So, I hope you found these techniques useful in your own work, and as always, for more tips, tutorials, and other art videos, subscribe to the channel. This has been from DMC Films and Centerblock Studios. See you guys next time.